Welcome, fellow wanderer of the wasteland, to the chronicles of 6 souls who shaped the world after the bombs fell. Tonight, we trace the paths of heroes who carried impossible burdens through a broken America, from Vault 76's hopeful dwellers to the mysterious sole survivor who emerged from centuries of frozen sleep. Each faced choices that would echo through generations, their stories woven together by threads of sacrifice, love, and the enduring hope that tomorrow might be better than today. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and allow their journeys to guide you into peaceful rest. Close your eyes when you're ready, and let us begin with America's first tentative steps back into the light. The morning of October 23rd, 2102, dawned bright and clear over the mountains of West Virginia, marking a day that would be remembered as Reclamation Day, the moment when America's chosen few would emerge from their underground sanctuary to begin the great work of rebuilding civilization. But unlike the nuclear devastation that had claimed so many other regions, the land that greeted the Vault 76 dwellers was a miracle of preservation, a testament to geography and fortune that had spared Appalachia from the direct fury of atomic fire. The vault door rolled open to reveal not the wasteland of ash and radiation that history had painted across so much of the continent, but a landscape that seemed to breathe with untouched life. Ancient mountains rolled away toward horizons painted in autumn colors, their slopes thick with forests that had never known the touch of nuclear winter. Rivers ran clear and cold between valleys where deer still grazed and birds still sang, where the very air itself carried the scent of growing things rather than the metallic tang of fallout and decay. For the vault dwellers who stepped into this Eden, the contrast with their expectations was almost overwhelming. They had trained for decades to face a world of monsters and radiation, to scrape survival from poisoned soil and contaminated water. Instead, they found themselves inheriting a paradise that seemed to promise not merely survival, but prosperity, not just existence, but the chance to build something better than what had been lost in the Great War. The first settlements they established reflected this optimism, built not from scavenged ruins, but from fresh timber cut from living forests, powered not by jury-rigged nuclear batteries, but by clean hydroelectric generators that harnessed the region's abundant waterways. These were not the desperate shanties of traditional wasteland communities, but planned towns with straight streets and proper foundations, monuments to the belief that the old world's mistakes need not define the new world's possibilities. But paradise, as the vault dwellers would learn, was not a destination but a responsibility that required constant vigilance to maintain. The same isolation that had protected Appalachia from nuclear devastation had also left it vulnerable to threats that more battle-hardened regions might have recognized and countered before they could take root. The mountains that had shielded the land from atomic fire now concealed horrors that would test every assumption the vault dwellers had made about their mission and their future. The first signs of trouble came from the mining communities that dotted the region's mountainsides, reports of workers falling ill with symptoms that no pre-war medical training could explain or treat. The afflicted would begin with simple fatigue and persistent coughs, ailments so common that they were initially dismissed as the inevitable result of hard labor in poorly ventilated mines. But the symptoms progressed with terrifying speed, transforming healthy men and women into something that could no longer be called human. The transformation was not merely physical but psychological, stripping away everything that made a person recognizably themselves, and replacing it with an alien hunger that drove them to attack anything that still retained the spark of conscious life. These were not the familiar ghouls of other regions, radiation-scarred but often retaining their humanity. These were creatures consumed by a plague that turned the very essence of consciousness into fuel for its own propagation, leaving behind shells that moved with purpose, but retained nothing of the souls they had once housed. The Scorched, as they came to be called, represented a threat unlike anything the Vault Dwellers had prepared to face. Their training had focused on rebuilding civilization in a world damaged by war, not defending paradise from a plague that sought to consume the very concept of conscious thought. The comfortable settlements they had built with such optimism became fortresses almost overnight, their planned communities transforming into desperate strongholds as the reality of their situation became clear. The source of the plague lay deep beneath the earth, in caverns that had been carved by forces older than human civilization, and were now home to creatures that defied every category of natural history. The Scorch Beasts were mutations beyond anything the war had produced elsewhere, winged nightmares whose very presence seemed to accelerate the spread of the disease that was consuming Appalachia's promise of renewal. They moved through underground networks that connected every part of the region, their alien cries echoing through limestone passages as they spread their corruption with methodical efficiency. Fighting the Scorch Beasts required tactics and strategies that no military manual had ever contemplated, forcing the Vault Dwellers to adapt from settlers and builders into something approaching an army. But this was not the clean warfare of pre-war conflicts, with clear objectives and measurable progress toward victory. This was a battle for the very soul of consciousness itself, fought against enemies that could turn allies into adversaries with a single infected breath. The weapons that proved most effective against the plague were not the conventional firearms that the Vault Dwellers had brought from their underground sanctuary, but the ultimate weapons of the old world, the nuclear missiles that still waited in automated silos scattered throughout the mountains. The irony was not lost on them. To save paradise from corruption, they would have to wound it with the same atomic fire that had destroyed so much else. The decision to use nuclear weapons against the Scorch Beast Queen represented a moral complexity that their training had never prepared them to face. The blast that consumed the fissure site where the Queen had made her lair was both an ending and a beginning, marking the successful conclusion of the Vault Dwellers' most desperate battle, while simultaneously introducing new uncertainties about what their victory had cost. The radiation that now contaminated the blast zone was clean compared to the psychic poison of the Scorched Plague, but it was still a wound in the landscape they had been sent to heal, a reminder that even necessary victories could carry terrible prices. In the aftermath of the Queen's destruction, the Vault Dwellers found themselves changed by their ordeal in ways that went beyond the tactical experience they had gained through months of desperate fighting. They had entered Appalachia as naive optimists, believing that good intentions and proper planning could overcome any obstacle. They emerged from their trial as something closer to the hardened survivors that populated other regions of the post-war world, their innocence preserved only in their determination to build something better than what they had been forced to destroy. The communities they established in the years following their victory were different from those first optimistic settlements, informed by hard-won knowledge about the price of safety and the vigilance that peace required. These were not merely towns but fortresses designed to withstand threats both seen and unseen, their foundations built not just from concrete and steel, but from the collective memory of how quickly paradise could transform into nightmare if its guardians grew complacent. The Vault Dwellers developed a vaccination against the Scorched Plague, a medical triumph that represented perhaps the most significant scientific achievement of the early post-war period. But the knowledge of what they had faced and overcome carried its own burden. The understanding that the peace they had won was not a permanent gift but a temporary respite that would require constant defense to maintain. They had learned that reclamation was not a single act but an ongoing commitment, not a destination reached but a path that must be walked with every choice and every day. As the years passed and contact with the outside world remained sporadic at best, The vault dwellers began to understand that their story would likely be lost to history, their victories and sacrifices forgotten by a world that had moved on without them. The records they kept of their achievements would moulder in archives that might never be discovered, their innovations and discoveries buried beneath decades of silence and isolation. They had succeeded in their mission to reclaim Appalachia, but success had come at the cost of relevance to the broader story of post-war recovery. Perhaps this was always meant to be their fate, to serve as America's forgotten first steps back towards civilization, a proof of concept that would be validated not by historical recognition, but by the simple fact of their continued existence in a world that had written off such possibilities. They had shown that paradise could be preserved even when it required the wisdom to wound it, that hope could survive even when it demanded the courage to fight for it with weapons that seemed to contradict everything it represented. The silence that eventually settled over Appalachia was not the silence of death, but the quiet of a people who had learned to value substance over recognition, who had chosen to build rather than boast, who had discovered that the most important victories were often the ones that history would never record. They had become the vault dwellers they were always meant to be, not just survivors but gardeners of a future that would flourish long after their names had been forgotten. In the end, their legacy was not written in monuments or remembered in songs, but lived in the daily reality of communities that had learned to thrive despite the constant presence of danger, in the quiet satisfaction of work well done and responsibility faithfully discharged. They had answered the call of Reclamation Day not with the dramatic gestures that history celebrates, but with the steady persistence that actually accomplishes its goals, creating something precious and preserving it through vigilance rather than violence, through wisdom rather than warfare. The mountains of West Virginia kept their secrets, holding close the story of America's first tentative steps back toward the light while the rest of the world continued its own painful journey toward whatever future awaited beyond the wasteland's horizon. The water crisis that would transform Albert Cole from vault security guard into the vault dweller began not with fanfare or drama, but with the quiet mechanical failure of a single component deep within the bowels of Vault 13. December 5th, 2161, marked the day when the water purification chip that had sustained the vault's population for over 80 years finally succumbed to the accumulated stress of decades without proper maintenance or replacement parts. The failure was not sudden but gradual, a slow decline in efficiency that the vault's technicians initially dismissed as routine fluctuation until the reality of their situation became impossible to ignore. Albert Cole had lived his entire 24 years within the vault's secure walls, raised on stories of the outside world that painted it as a hellscape of radiation and mutation, where death waited around every corner. His role as security officer had been comfortable and predictable, focused on minor disputes between residents and the occasional technical emergency that required someone with steady nerves and basic training in crisis management. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for the moment when Overseer Jacoran called him into the office and explained that the vault's survival depended on someone venturing into the wasteland to find a replacement water chip. The selection process that led to Cole's nomination was not based on heroic qualities or special qualifications, but on the practical considerations that governed all vault decisions. He was young enough to survive the physical demands of wasteland travel, experienced enough to handle unexpected dangers, and most importantly, expendable enough that his loss would not cripple the vault's essential functions. The mathematics of survival were cruel but simple. 99 people could not be risked to save 99 people, so one person would be risked to save them all. The vault suit that Cole wore as he stepped through the massive door for the first time in his life was more than clothing. It was a symbol of everything he was leaving behind and everything he hoped to preserve. The blue fabric marked him as a child of the underground, a creature of climate-controlled corridors and recycled air, stepping into a world that operated by rules he had never learned and faced challenges he could barely imagine. The Pip-Boy strapped to his wrist contained maps and data that were decades out of date, optimistic projections of a post-war recovery that had never materialized. The wasteland that greeted Cole was simultaneously worse and better than Vault propaganda had suggested. The radiation levels were indeed dangerous, requiring constant vigilance and careful route planning to avoid the worst contamination zones. But life had returned to the surface in forms both familiar and alien, creating an ecosystem that was functional if not comfortable, dangerous but not universally lethal. The key to survival was not the avoidance of all risk, but the intelligent assessment of which risks were worth taking and which were not. Shady Sands was Cole's first real encounter with post-war civilization, a small farming community that had managed to establish something approaching normalcy in the decades since the bombs fell. The sight of children playing in irrigated fields while their parents worked crops that actually grew in contaminated soil was both inspiring and heartbreaking, proof that human ingenuity could overcome even the most devastating setbacks while serving as a reminder of how much had been lost in the process. These people had built their lives from nothing, creating meaning and purpose without the technological advantages that Vault dwellers took for granted. The relationship that developed between Cole and the surface communities was complex and often uncomfortable, marked by mutual dependence that neither side entirely trusted. The Vault dweller possessed knowledge and equipment that could solve problems the Wastelanders had struggled with for decades, but he also represented a reminder of the pre-war world's failures and the isolation that had allowed Vault dwellers to survive while others suffered. His help was welcomed, but his presence was sometimes resented. His technology appreciated, but his ignorance of post-war realities occasionally infuriating. The hub represented Cole's first glimpse of post-war commerce and politics, a trading center where the New World's economy was slowly taking shape through barter and negotiation, rather than the regulated distribution systems that had characterized Vault life. Here, survival depended not just on individual skill, but on the ability to navigate complex social networks where reputation and relationships were as valuable as caps or ammunition. The lessons Cole learned about negotiation and compromise would prove essential when he eventually faced challenges that could not be solved through technical expertise alone. But it was the discovery of super mutants that forced Cole to confront the true scope of the threat facing the wasteland, and the inadequacy of his original mission parameters. The water chip that had brought him to the surface was revealed as merely the first symptom of a much larger problem, one that could not be solved by replacing broken technology, but required confronting the twisted ambitions of beings who had abandoned humanity in pursuit of what they believed was evolutionary perfection. The Master's army was not a conventional military force, but a religious movement dedicated to the systematic transformation of all surface life into something that bore no resemblance to the species that had survived the Great War. The super mutants were not raiders seeking temporary advantage, but missionaries spreading a gospel of forced evolution that would eliminate human consciousness in favor of something they considered superior. The horror was not just their strength or their numbers, but their absolute conviction that they were performing an act of mercy by destroying everything that made their victims recognizably human. The journey to locate and infiltrate the cathedral required Cole to master skills that no Vault training had ever covered, learning to think like a spy and fight like a soldier, while maintaining the moral clarity that separated him from the enemies he was trying to defeat. The psychological pressure was enormous, requiring him to present himself as sympathetic to the Master's cause, while gathering the intelligence necessary to destroy it completely. The infiltration was not just a test of his tactical abilities, but of his fundamental identity, challenging his understanding of what it meant to be human in a world where humanity itself was under assault. The confrontation with the Master in the depths of the cathedral was not a battle in any conventional sense, but a philosophical debate conducted with the stakes set at nothing less than the future of conscious life on Earth. The Master was not insane, but rationally committed to a vision of perfection that required the elimination of individual consciousness in favor of collective unity. His arguments were logically consistent and emotionally compelling, offering an end to the suffering and conflict that had defined post-war existence in exchange for the surrender of everything that made life worth living. Cole's victory over the Master was achieved not through superior firepower, but through superior reasoning, presenting evidence that the super mutant program was flawed, and that the unity the Master sought was impossible to achieve through forced evolution. The destruction of the cathedral and the military base that produced the super mutant army was anticlimactic after the intensity of the philosophical confrontation, a necessary cleanup operation that eliminated the infrastructure of transformation without addressing the deeper questions about human nature and destiny that the Master had raised. The return to Vault 13 should have been triumphant, but Cole found himself facing a dilemma that his mission briefing had never anticipated. The man who had left the vault was not the same person who returned, transformed by experiences that had forced him to grow in ways that the vault's controlled environment could never have permitted. He had seen the worst of post-war life, but also its potential for renewal, had witnessed the depths of human cruelty, but also the heights of courage and sacrifice that desperate circumstances could inspire. Overseer Jacorin's decision to exile Cole from the vault was not based on malice, but on the practical recognition that the man who returned was no longer compatible with the closed system that had shaped him. The vault dweller had become something new, a hybrid of underground safety and surface adaptability, who could no longer be contained by the walls that had once defined his entire world. The exile was presented as punishment, but was actually acknowledgement of transformation, recognition that Cole had evolved beyond the community that had created him. The wasteland that welcomed Cole as a permanent resident was different from the hostile environment he had first encountered while searching for the water chip. His reputation as the man who had defeated the Master preceded him, creating opportunities for leadership and influence that he had never sought but found himself accepting out of necessity. The scattered communities that dotted the landscape needed someone who understood both the technological resources of the old world and the survival requirements of the new one. The group of vault dwellers who eventually joined Cole in exile were not rebels or malcontents, but individuals who had been changed by his stories and example, people who had begun to question whether safety was worth the price of stagnation. They left Vault 13 not in anger but in hope, believing that the future lay not in preserving the past but in building something new from the combination of old knowledge and new experience. Their exodus was not a rejection of Vault values but an extension of them into a world that needed the stability and wisdom that underground life had preserved. The journey north that led to the founding of Arroyo was both a physical migration and a spiritual pilgrimage, a search for a place where the lessons learned in the wasteland could be applied to the creation of a sustainable community. The location they eventually chose was not the most comfortable or the safest, but the one that offered the best balance of resources and challenges, a place where growth would be possible but not easy, where success would require constant effort but failure would not mean automatic death. Pat was not Cole's first romantic relationship, but she was his first partnership with someone who understood both the weight of leadership and the loneliness that came with being responsible for other people's survival. Their courtship was conducted against the background of community building. Their marriage ceremony doubled as a founding celebration for Arroyo itself. The two daughters they raised together were not just their children, but the next generation of a new kind of civilization, one that combined vault discipline with surface adaptability. The years Cole spent as leader of Arroyo were marked not by dramatic adventures, but by the quiet satisfaction of problems solved and progress made through careful planning and patient work. The community grew from a collection of refugees into a functioning society, complete with its own customs and traditions that honored both the pre-war world and the post-war reality. The success was measured not in conquered territory or defeated enemies, but in children who grew up healthy, crops that provided adequate nutrition, and conflicts resolved through discussion rather than violence. Pat's death marked the beginning of Cole's gradual withdrawal from active leadership, not because he was no longer capable, but because he recognized that the community he had helped create needed to learn to function without depending on any single individual for its survival. The transition of authority was managed carefully over several years, with Cole remaining available for advice and consultation, while younger leaders took responsibility for daily administration and long-term planning. The memoirs that Cole wrote at the request of Arroyo's council were not intended as historical record, but as practical guidance for future generations, documenting not just what had happened, but why certain decisions had been made, and what lessons could be drawn from both successes and failures. The writing process was therapeutic for Cole, but also exhausting, requiring him to relive experiences that he had spent years trying to process and integrate into his understanding of himself and his world. The decision to leave Arroyo after completing his memoirs was not abandonment, but graduation, recognition that the community had achieved the stability and self-sufficiency that had always been the ultimate goal of his leadership. The vault suit folded on his bed was not a discarded uniform, but a symbol of completion, evidence that the boy who had left Vault 13 in search of a water chip had finally finished the journey that had begun with that simple mechanical failure decades earlier. The signature, The Wanderer, that concluded Cole's memoirs was not false modesty, but accurate description of what he had become through his experiences in the wasteland. He was no longer the vault dweller, defined by his origin and his first mission, but something larger and more complex. A person whose identity had been shaped by years of movement and change, rather than the static security of underground life. The name acknowledged both his past and his future, honoring the journey that had brought him to Arroyo while recognizing that the journey itself was not yet complete. The final departure from Arroyo was conducted without ceremony or announcement, Cole simply walking away from the life he had built, in the same way he had once walked away from the life that had been built for him. The difference was that this time he left behind something that would survive and flourish in his absence, a community that embodied the best aspects of both vault discipline and wasteland adaptability. His legacy was not written in stone or preserved in museums, but lived in the daily choices made by people who had learned from his example that survival was not enough, that the goal was not just to endure, but to build something worth preserving. The wasteland swallowed Cole as completely as it had welcomed him, accepting him back into the vast spaces between communities where solitary figures moved according to their own purposes and schedules. He became part of the legend and mythology of the post-war world, a story told around campfires and trading posts about the man who had saved the wasteland from the master's vision of unity. But legends, as Cole understood better than most, were just stories that people told to make sense of experiences too complex for simple explanation, and the truth was always more complicated than the tales that preserved it. In the end, Albert Cole had become exactly what the wasteland needed him to become. Not a hero in any conventional sense, but a bridge between worlds, a person who could translate the wisdom of the past into the needs of the future. His story was not complete with his departure from Arroyo, but continued in every choice made by the people he had influenced. Every problem solved using methods he had demonstrated. Every community built according to principles he had helped establish. The Vault Dweller had ended, but the Wanderer continued, carrying the best of both worlds into whatever tomorrow might bring. The drought that would define the Chosen One's destiny began not with a single season of failed rains, but with the slow, inexorable transformation of the land around Arroyo into something that could no longer sustain the community that the Vault Dweller had built from hope and determination. By 2241, 80 years after Albert Cole had first emerged from Vault 13, the village that bore his legacy faced a crisis that threatened to undo everything he had accomplished. Through decades of careful leadership and patient cultivation of wasteland soil, the young man who had become known as the Chosen One had grown up hearing stories of his grandfather's legendary journey, tales that seemed both impossibly heroic and strangely distant from the daily realities of village life. Where the Vault Dweller had faced super mutants and the Master's army, his grandson dealt with failed irrigation systems and dwindling water tables. Where Cole had navigated the politics of emerging wasteland nations, the Chosen One mediated disputes over crop rotations and livestock grazing rights. The contrast between grandfather and grandson seemed to suggest that heroism was a luxury that prosperity had made unnecessary. The village elder Hakunin's vision of the Holy Vault 13 was not presented as prophecy, but as practical guidance. A dream that offered specific solutions to problems that conventional wisdom could not address. The Garden of Eden creation kit that supposedly waited in the ancestral vault represented more than technological salvation, but it embodied the promise that the past could still provide answers for the present, that the legacy of pre-war knowledge remained accessible to those brave enough to seek it out. The vision was compelling precisely because it offered hope grounded in historical precedent rather than wishful thinking. The journey to Vault 13 that began the Chosen One's transformation from village troublemaker to wasteland hero was undertaken not with the naive optimism that had characterized his grandfather's first venture into the unknown, but with the grim determination of someone who understood that failure meant the death of everything he had ever known. The wasteland that greeted him was different from the one the Vault Dweller had encountered 80 years earlier, changed by time and human activity into something that was simultaneously more civilized and more dangerous. The new California Republic that the Chosen One encountered during his travels was both the fulfillment of his grandfather's vision and a cautionary tale about the unintended consequences of success. The democratic ideals and technological progress that NCR represented were admirable achievements, proof that post-war civilization could aspire to something greater than mere survival. But the bureaucracy and expansion that accompanied this success had created new forms of inequality and conflict, demonstrating that even the best intentions could produce results that departed significantly from original goals. Vault City embodied the other extreme of post-war development, a technocratic enclave that had preserved pre-war knowledge and living standards at the cost of moral flexibility and human empathy. The citizens who lived within its walls enjoyed health and comfort that surpassed even pre-war standards, but their prosperity was built on the systematic exploitation of outsiders who were deemed genetically and culturally inferior. The Chosen One's encounters with Vault City's leadership forced him to confront difficult questions about the relationship between technological advancement and social justice. The death claws that had colonized Vault 13 represented one of the wasteland's most successful adaptations to post-war conditions. Intelligent predators who had claimed the vault not through malice, but through the simple logic of superior evolution. Their presence in the ancestral home was simultaneously disappointing and inspiring, proof that nature would reclaim what humans abandoned while demonstrating that intelligence and social organization were not uniquely human traits. The peaceful resolution of the Deathclaw situation required the Chosen One to think beyond conventional categories of friend and enemy. New Reno was the Chosen One's first encounter with post-war vice and corruption on an organized scale, a city where the old world's worst impulses had been refined and systematized into a functioning economy built on exploitation and moral compromise. The four families that controlled the city's operations were not simple criminals, but sophisticated business people who had recognized that human weakness was a more reliable foundation for prosperity than human virtue. The relationships the Chosen One formed in New Reno would have consequences that extended far beyond his immediate mission. The romantic entanglements that developed during the Chosen One's time in New Reno were not casual diversions, but strategic alliances that demonstrated his growing understanding of how personal relationships could be leveraged for political advantage. The affair with either Mrs. Bishop or her daughter Angela was calculated to gain access to information and resources that would otherwise have been unavailable, but the emotional and biological consequences of these relationships would reshape the future of both families in ways that neither participant could have anticipated at the time. The son who would eventually emerge from these calculated seductions was not planned, but he became a crucial link between the Chosen One's mission and the broader political landscape of post-war California. John Bishop's rise to power within the crime family structure and his later expansion into legitimate politics demonstrated how individual choices could have generational consequences, how a single night's strategic calculation could alter the course of regional development in ways that extended far beyond the original participants' intentions or expectations. The enclave that the Chosen One eventually confronted represented the old world's most dangerous legacy, a shadow government that had survived the Great War by abandoning everything that had made pre-war America worth preserving. Their plan to release a modified strain of the forced evolutionary virus into the atmosphere was not motivated by malice, but by a twisted patriotism that defined genetic purity as the ultimate expression of American values. The horror was not their willingness to commit genocide, but their absolute conviction that mass murder represented the highest form of civic duty. The infiltration of Navarro required the Chosen One to master skills that combined his grandfather's tactical genius with innovations that reflected the more complex political landscape of the later wasteland period. The Enclave's military discipline and technological advantages could not be overcome through direct confrontation, but their ideological rigidity created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone willing to think creatively about the relationship between identity and loyalty. The disguises and deceptions that gained access to their stronghold were not mere trickery, but sophisticated psychological operations. The oil rig that served as the Enclave's primary base was a monument to pre-war hubris, a floating fortress that embodied everything that had gone wrong with American leadership in the decades before the Great War. The technology that powered their operations was impressive but sterile, creating an environment that felt more like a museum than a living community. The Chosen One's exploration of the facility revealed the essential emptiness at the heart of the Enclave's vision, the way that their obsession with genetic purity had stripped away everything that made life worth preserving. The confrontation with President Richardson and the decision to destroy the oil rig were not simply tactical victories, but moral statements about the future of post-war America. The Enclave's defeat represented a rejection of the old world's worst tendencies and a commitment to building something better from the diverse communities that had emerged from the wasteland's challenges. The explosion that consumed their floating fortress was both an ending and a beginning, eliminating one vision of America's future while opening space for alternatives that were more inclusive and humane. The rescue of the Vault 13 dwellers and the Arroyo villagers from Enclave captivity was complicated by the discovery that the two groups had developed very different approaches to survival during their decades of separation. The Vault dwellers had preserved pre-war knowledge and technology, but at the cost of practical experience and cultural flexibility. The villagers had adapted successfully to wasteland conditions, but lacked the technical resources necessary for large-scale development projects. The integration of these communities required careful negotiation and compromise from all parties. The Garden of Eden creation kit that had motivated the Chosen One's original quest proved to be both more and less than the salvation that Arroyo had hoped to find. The technology it contained was genuinely revolutionary, capable of transforming desert into farmland and creating sustainable communities that could support populations far larger than traditional wasteland settlements. But the kit was not a magic solution that could solve all problems automatically. Its effectiveness depended on the wisdom and cooperation of the people who used it, qualities that could not be manufactured or programmed. The new community that emerged from the merger of Arroyo villagers and Vault 13 dwellers represented a unique experiment in post-war social organization, combining the practical experience of surface survivors with the preserved knowledge of underground civilization. The settlement that grew around the Gek's terraforming capabilities was not merely larger and more prosperous than its predecessors, but qualitatively different, a proof of concept that demonstrated how pre-war technology could be integrated with post-war wisdom to create something genuinely new. The Chosen One's role as elder of this expanded community was both reward and burden. Recognition of his heroic achievements, combined with responsibility for the daily management of hundreds of people with diverse backgrounds and conflicting priorities. The leadership skills he had developed during his journey through the wasteland were adequate for crisis management, but required significant adaptation for the more complex challenges of peacetime administration. The transition from hero to administrator was not automatic or easy. The years that followed the community's establishment were marked not by dramatic adventures, but by the patient work of building institutions that could function effectively across cultural boundaries. The integration of Vault Dweller technology with tribal social structures required innovations that drew from both traditions while being limited by neither. The legal systems, educational programs, and economic structures that emerged from this process were uniquely adapted to post-war conditions, while remaining flexible enough to evolve with changing circumstances. The son who had been conceived in New Reno during the Chosen One's strategic seduction eventually made contact with his biological father, creating a relationship that was both personal and political. John Bishop's legitimate business interests and political connections provided opportunities for expanded trade and cooperation, but his criminal background and family associations created complications that required careful navigation. The relationship between father and son became a model for the broader challenge of integrating the wasteland's diverse communities into something approaching a coherent civilization. The Chosen One's later years as elder were characterized by increasing delegation of authority to younger leaders who had been trained in both traditional tribal customs and Vault Dweller technical methods. The community's success had created new challenges that required different skills and perspectives, and the Chosen One's recognition of his own limitations as an aging leader demonstrated the same practical wisdom that had characterized his approach to earlier challenges. The transition of power was managed gradually and carefully to ensure continuity of leadership. The legends that grew up around the Chosen One's achievements were both accurate and incomplete, capturing the dramatic moments of his journey, while missing the quieter but equally important work of community building that had consumed most of his adult life. The stories told by traders and travelers focused on battles won and enemies defeated, but the more significant legacy was the proof that post-war communities could grow beyond mere survival to achieve something approaching pre-war prosperity without sacrificing the hard-won wisdom that wasteland experience had provided. The mystery surrounding the Chosen One's later life and eventual fate reflected his own preference for privacy and his understanding that legends were more powerful than historical facts when it came to inspiring future generations of wasteland heroes. The suggestion that he might have become the wandering figure known as Nobark was both plausible and romantic, offering a vision of the hero as eternal wanderer whose adventures continued long after his official story had ended. Whether true or not, the theory captured something important about the relationship between individual achievement and community memory. The lasting impact of the Chosen One's journey was not measured in monuments or official recognition, but in the daily reality of communities that had learned to combine the best aspects of pre-war and post-war civilization, the techniques for integrating diverse populations, the institutions that balanced efficiency with fairness, and the technologies that enhanced human capability without replacing human judgment, became models that spread throughout the wasteland. As traders and travelers carried word of Arroyo's success to other struggling settlements. In the end, the Chosen One had fulfilled not just his immediate mission to save Arroyo, but the broader destiny that his grandfather's example had suggested was possible for wasteland heroes. He had proven that individual courage and determination could achieve results that seemed impossible, that communities separated by ideology and experience could learn to work together for mutual benefit, and that the future was not predetermined by the failures of the past, but remained open to the influence of people willing to work for something better than what they had inherited. The legacy that the Chosen One left to future generations was not a perfect world, but a better one. Not a final solution to post-war challenges, but proven methods for addressing them constructively. His story became part of the larger narrative of wasteland recovery, one chapter in the long process of rebuilding civilization from the fragments that had survived nuclear fire, and the innovations that necessity had inspired among the survivors who refused to accept that the end of the world was also the end of hope for human progress and cooperation. The morning of August 17th, 2277, dawned with deceptive normalcy in the sterile corridors of Vault 101, where a 19-year-old young man, who would become known as the Lone Wanderer, completed what he believed would be another routine day in the underground sanctuary that had been his entire world. The vault that had sheltered him since infancy was designed to remain sealed for 200 years, a closed ecosystem where every variable was controlled and every outcome predetermined by Vault-Tech's social experiments. But the carefully maintained illusion of safety and predictability was about to be shattered by a father's desperate decision and a son's reluctant heroism. James had been planning his departure from Vault 101 for months, driven by a vision of Project Purity that had consumed his thoughts since before his son's birth. The water purification system he had abandoned 20 years earlier when he fled to the vault with his infant child represented more than scientific achievement. It embodied the possibility that the capital wasteland's poisoned landscape could be healed, that the generations of suffering caused by radioactive water could finally be brought to an end. The decision to leave his son behind was not abandonment but protection, an attempt to shield the boy from the dangers that awaited anyone who dared to dream of changing the wasteland's fundamental realities. The Lone Wanderer's pursuit of his father was motivated not by heroic ambition, but by the simple need to understand why the most important person in his life had chosen to abandon everything they had built together in the vaults. Artificial safety. The world that greeted him outside Vault 101's massive door was simultaneously more beautiful and more terrifying than anything Vault education had prepared him to encounter. The capital wasteland stretched away toward horizons painted in shades of brown and grey, a landscape where every landmark told a story of destruction and every survivor carried scars that spoke of unimaginable loss. Megaton was the lone wanderer's first encounter with post-war civilization, a community built around an unexploded nuclear bomb that embodied both the resourcefulness and the fatalism that characterized wasteland culture. The decision to preserve the town rather than detonate it for Mr. Burke's twisted entertainment was not based on moral calculation, but on instinctive revulsion at the idea of destroying something that represented hope and cooperation in a world that offered precious little of either. The choice established a pattern that would define the lone wanderer's approach to the moral dilemmas that awaited him throughout the capital wasteland. Sheriff Lucas Sims became both mentor and cautionary tale for the young vault dweller, demonstrating the kind of practical leadership that kept communities alive in the post-war world, while also illustrating the dangers that faced anyone who tried to maintain law and order in a lawless land. The confrontation with Mr. Burke that cost Sims his life was a direct consequence of the lone wanderer's decision to report the Enclave agent's plan, creating the first of many situations where good intentions would produce tragic consequences that could not be undone through regret or better planning. The Wasteland Survival Guide that Moira Brown commissioned represented more than a practical manual for post-war living. It was an attempt to codify and preserve the knowledge that kept people alive in conditions that pre-war science had never imagined. The research expeditions that the lone wanderer undertook on Moira's behalf were simultaneously educational and transformative, teaching him skills that no vault curriculum had included, while forcing him to confront the daily realities of radiation, mutation, and violence that defined existence outside the underground sanctuaries. The super-duper Mart expedition that nearly cost the lone wanderer his life was a harsh introduction to the kind of tactical thinking that surface survival required, where a single mistake could mean death and victory was often measured not by what was gained, but by what was avoided. The raiders who had claimed the abandoned store as their territory were not evil in any abstract sense, but desperate people who had chosen predation over cooperation as their strategy for staying alive. The moral complexity of the situation was typical of the choices that awaited vault dwellers who ventured into the wasteland's ambiguous landscape. The discovery of his father's location in Vault 112 forced the lone wanderer to confront the reality that not all vault experiments had been as benign as the social isolation that had defined his own upbringing. The virtual reality pods that held the vault's residents in permanent unconsciousness represented Vault-Tech's most sinister achievement, the complete subjugation of human consciousness to technological control disguised as entertainment and comfort. The rescue of James from this digital prison required not just technical skill, but the psychological strength to resist the temptation of retreating into comfortable illusion when reality became too difficult to bear. Project Purity represented James's attempt to address the capital wasteland's fundamental problem through scientific innovation rather than political negotiation or military conquest. The Jefferson Memorial that housed the water purification system was both symbol and substance, a monument to pre-war idealism that might actually function as intended if enough people were willing to sacrifice their immediate interests for long-term benefit. The project's success would require not just technical expertise, but the kind of cooperation between former enemies that the wasteland's harsh realities had made almost impossible to achieve. The Enclave's intervention at Jefferson Memorial was not motivated by malice, but by a vision of genetic purity that made them incapable of accepting any solution to the wasteland's problems that did not involve the systematic elimination of everyone they deemed genetically contaminated. Their arrival transformed Project Purity from a humanitarian mission into a battlefield where the future of post-war America would be decided not through democratic deliberation, but through superior firepower and tactical positioning. The conflict was inevitable once both sides had committed to incompatible visions of what the wasteland's future should look like. James's sacrifice to protect Project Purity from Enclave control was both heroic and tragic, a father's final gift to his son and to the wasteland community that had sheltered them both during their years of exile from the vault. The radiation poisoning that killed him was a conscious choice, a decision to die as he had lived, in service to the ideal that scientific knowledge should be used to heal rather than harm, to build rather than destroy. The legacy he left to the Lone Wanderer was not just the technical specifications for water purification, but the moral framework that made such projects worth pursuing despite their enormous risks. The Brotherhood of Steel that welcomed the Lone Wanderer after his father's death was different from the organization that had appeared in previous wasteland conflicts. Evolved by contact with the capital wasteland's unique challenges into something that balanced military efficiency with humanitarian concern. Elder Lyons had adapted Brotherhood doctrine to local conditions, recognizing that technology hoarding served no useful purpose when the communities that might benefit from advanced science were dying from problems that existing knowledge could solve. The tension between traditional Brotherhood values and practical necessity created opportunities for outsiders like the Lone Wanderer to influence the organization's direction. The months of training and missions that transformed the Lone Wanderer from Vault Dweller to Brotherhood Knight were marked not by dramatic battles, but by the gradual accumulation of experience and responsibility that taught him to think like a soldier while retaining the moral clarity that separated protectors from predators. The super mutant threats that dominated Brotherhood operations in the capital wasteland were different from the Master's army that the original Vault Dweller had faced, driven not by ideological conviction, but by simple hunger and territorial aggression that made them dangerous but not existentially threatening. The capture and imprisonment at Raven Rock that interrupted the Lone Wanderer's Brotherhood service was both humiliation and education, demonstrating the Enclave's technological superiority, while also revealing the fundamental weakness of their position. President Eden's attempt to recruit the Vault Dweller to his cause was not based on recognition of superior loyalty or ideological compatibility, but on the simple calculation that someone raised in a controlled environment might be more susceptible to authority than wastelanders who had learned independence through necessity. The destruction of Raven Rock that marked the Lone Wanderer's escape from Enclave custody was not planned as a strategic operation, but occurred as the consequence of decisions made under pressure by someone who understood that desperate situations sometimes required desperate measures. The nuclear self-destruct that consumed the Enclave's primary base eliminated their command structure and technological advantages, but it also demonstrated the kind of ruthless pragmatism that successful wasteland survival required. The explosion was both liberation and loss of innocence, marking the moment when the Vault Dweller's moral universe became as complicated as the wasteland itself. The final assault on Jefferson Memorial that restored Project Purity to Brotherhood control was anticlimactic after the intensity of the Raven Rock escape, a conventional military operation that succeeded through superior numbers and coordination rather than individual heroism or tactical innovation. The activation of the water purification system was accomplished not through dramatic gesture, but through careful attention to technical procedures, a reminder that most genuine achievements resulted from competent execution of well-planned operations, rather than spontaneous inspiration or lucky improvisation. The 2 weeks between the Battle of Project Purity and the assault on Adams Air Force Base passed in a blur of medical treatment and strategic planning, time that allowed the Lone Wanderer to process the psychological impact of his father's death while preparing for the final confrontation with Enclave forces. The promotion to Brotherhood Knight was recognition not just of tactical accomplishments, but of personal transformation. Acknowledgement that the frightened teenager, who had fled Vault 101, had become someone capable of leadership in the wasteland's most challenging situations. The raid on Adams Air Force Base represented the culmination of everything the Lone Wanderer had learned about warfare, requiring the integration of technical knowledge, tactical skill, and moral judgment that had been developed through months of gradually increasing responsibility. The destruction of the Enclave's air power eliminated their ability to project force beyond the capital wasteland, ensuring that their authoritarian vision of post-war America would not spread to other regions where more democratic alternatives were taking root. The victory was complete but costly, achieved through methods that left psychological scars on everyone who participated. The aftermath of the Enclave's defeat should have provided opportunity for the Lone Wanderer to enjoy the peace and prosperity that his sacrifices had made possible. But the changing nature of the Brotherhood of Steel under Arthur Maxson's emerging leadership created tensions that made continued service increasingly difficult. The organization's gradual shift away from Elder Lyon's humanitarian mission toward more traditional technology hoarding and territorial expansion represented a betrayal of the ideals that had motivated the Lone Wanderer's original commitment to the cause. The erasure of the Lone Wanderer from official Brotherhood records was not accidental oversight but deliberate revisionist history, an attempt to claim credit for the water purification project and the Enclave's defeat, while eliminating evidence of Elder Lyon's controversial policies. The young soldiers who served under Maxson were taught that the Brotherhood's success in the capital wasteland resulted from superior doctrine and military discipline, rather than cooperation with outsiders and adaptation to local conditions. The truth became politically inconvenient and was therefore quietly forgotten. The theory that the Lone Wanderer became the railroad operative known as Deacon was both romantic and plausible, offering an explanation for his disappearance that honored his commitment to protecting the innocent while accounting for his intimate knowledge of the capital wasteland and his obvious discomfort with the Brotherhood's authoritarian evolution. The facial reconstruction surgery that created Deacon's appearance could easily have been performed by Dr. Ten Pinkerton in Rivet City, and the timeline allowed for the kind of political disillusionment that might drive someone to abandon their former identity entirely. The story about the University Point death clause that Deacon told to explain his hatred of anti-synth extremism was consistent with the kind of personal tragedy that had shaped other railroad operatives, but the specific details suggested knowledge of Brotherhood internal politics that outsiders would not possess. The allegory of Sarah Lyon's replacement by a synth and subsequent execution by Brotherhood hardliners provided both motive for the Lone Wanderer's departure from the organization and explanation for Maxson's pathological hatred of artificial humans. The theory required several assumptions, but no logical impossibilities. The marriage between the Lone Wanderer and Sarah Lyons that the theory proposed would have been natural development of the professional relationship and mutual respect that had characterized their interactions during the water purification campaign. Sarah's leadership of the Lyons' pride and her commitment to her father's humanitarian mission made her an obvious ally for someone whose own values had been shaped by Project Purity's idealistic goals. The relationship would have represented hope for the Brotherhood's future direction under leaders who understood that technology should serve people rather than being hoarded for its own sake. The assassination of Sarah Lyons during a routine mission that the theory suggested would have required careful planning and coordination between Maxson loyalists and outcasts who had never accepted Elder Lyon's reforms. The operation would have been justified as necessary for the Brotherhood's survival, eliminating leaders whose policies were seen as weakening the organization's military effectiveness and technological advantages. The cover-up would have been relatively simple given the dangerous nature of wasteland operations and the high casualty rates that characterized Brotherhood missions. The transformation from lone wanderer to deacon would have required not just physical disguise but psychological reconstruction, the creation of a new identity that could function effectively in railroad operations while carrying the emotional burden of personal loss and institutional betrayal. The compulsive lying that characterized Deacon's personality could be understood as a defensive mechanism, a way of protecting painful truths while maintaining the flexibility necessary for undercover work. The railroad's mission of protecting artificial humans would have appealed to someone whose own humanity had been denied by the organization he had served. The alternative theory that the lone wanderer had simply disappeared into the wasteland as a solitary wanderer was equally plausible but less dramatically satisfying, suggesting that some heroes were not transformed by their experiences, but simply worn down by them. The psychological toll of repeated trauma and moral compromise might have made normal social relationships impossible, leaving the former vault dweller with no choice but to retreat into the kind of isolation that had once been forced upon him but now became voluntary refuge from a world too complex for simple solutions. The space program ending that allowed players to leave Earth entirely was canon within the game's narrative structure, but difficult to reconcile with the lone wanderer's established commitment to wasteland communities and their welfare. The decision to abandon the capital wasteland, after working so hard to improve its conditions, would represent either profound character change or complete breakdown of the moral framework that had guided previous choices. The theory was technically possible, but thematically inconsistent with everything the character had demonstrated about personal values and social responsibility. In the end, the lone wanderer's true fate remained unknown because the wasteland had taught him that survival sometimes required the ability to disappear completely, to shed identities that had become liabilities, and create new ones that served current needs rather than past achievements. Whether he became deacon, wandered alone through irradiated ruins, or found some other path to continued existence, his legacy was preserved, not in official records, but in the clean water that flowed from Project Purity and the communities that had learned from his example that cooperation was possible even in the harshest circumstances. The silence that surrounded the lone wanderer's disappearance was itself a form of testimony, evidence that some forms of heroism were too dangerous to commemorate, and some truths too inconvenient for institutional memory. The Brotherhood's success in rewriting history demonstrated their power, but also revealed their weakness, the need to deny their dependence on outsiders and their debt to leaders whose vision had exceeded the limitations of common organizational doctrine. The erasure was both victory and defeat, eliminating problematic evidence, while also losing access to the wisdom that had made that evidence possible. The shot that shattered the silence of Goodsprings Cemetery on the night of October 19th, 2281, was meant to be final, a 9mm execution that would close the book on a courier's life and eliminate the last obstacle between Benny and his vision of an independent New Vegas. But death, as the figure who would become known simply as the Courier would learn, was not always the ending it appeared to be, and some stories were too important to conclude with a shallow grave in the Mojave's sandy soil. The resurrection that followed was not miraculous, but medical, the result of Doc Mitchell's steady hands and comprehensive knowledge of wasteland trauma surgery, combined with the peculiar resilience that seemed to characterize those who made their living traveling the dangerous roads between settlements. The bullet that should have scrambled the courier's brains had instead followed a trajectory that damaged memory and motor function while leaving the essential core of consciousness intact, creating a blank slate that retained skills and instincts while losing the personal history that had originally defined identity. Victor's cheerful greeting and the Securitron's obvious satisfaction with the courier's recovery suggested layers of manipulation and planning that extended far beyond the simple package delivery job that had brought this particular traveler to the crossroads where three futures converged. The robot's folksy demeanor concealed sophisticated artificial intelligence, directed by purposes that would not become clear until much later, when the courier's choices had already set in motion. Events that would reshape the balance of power across the entire southwestern wasteland. The platinum chip that had cost the courier's life was more than valuable technology. It represented the key to Mr. House's centuries-long plan to transform the Mojave Desert from post-war wasteland into a beacon of pre-war prosperity and innovation. The device contained upgrade codes that would modernize the Securitron army that protected New Vegas, transforming House's modest security force into a military power capable of enforcing independence against any external threat. The irony was not lost that a simple delivery job had become the fulcrum upon which the future of multiple nations would balance. Prim's problems with escaped convicts and absent authority provided the courier's first opportunity to understand how individual choices could have community-wide consequences in the post-war world. The decision of whether to install a new sheriff and which candidate to support was not just local politics, but a microcosm of the larger governance questions that faced every settlement in the wasteland. The NCR's bureaucratic approach, the new California Republic's democratic ideals, and independent local leadership each offered different solutions with different costs and benefits that extended far beyond immediate law enforcement needs. The NCR Correctional Facility, where Benny's associates had taken refuge, represented the Republic's approach to criminal justice and social control, a pre-war institution adapted to post-war realities through expedient compromise rather than principled reform. The powder gangers who had claimed the facility as their territory were not revolutionaries fighting systemic oppression, but opportunists who had chosen predation over cooperation as their survival strategy. The moral complexity of the situation reflected the broader challenges facing any attempt to establish legitimate authority in a region where violence was often the most effective form of political expression. Nipton's destruction at the hands of Caesar's legion provided the courier's first direct encounter with the totalitarian efficiency that characterized the Eastern faction's approach to territorial expansion and social organization. The systematic execution of the town's residents was not random violence, but carefully calculated psychological warfare designed to terrorize potential opponents while demonstrating the futility of resistance to Legion authority. The crucifixions that lined the road approaching the town were both punishment and advertisement, warning to anyone who might consider opposing Caesar's vision of ordered brutality. The meeting with Volpe's Inculta in Nipton's ruins was simultaneously introduction and recruitment interview, an opportunity for the Legion to evaluate the courier's potential usefulness while providing information about their ideology and methods. The Frumentarius's casual discussion of mass murder as necessary political action revealed the complete moral transformation that Legion service required, the abandonment of individual conscience in favor of collective purpose that made their military effectiveness possible. The encounter established parameters for future interactions while leaving all options open for development. Novak's dinosaur and the sniper's nest that overlooked the town's main street embodied the kind of frontier vigilance that characterized independent communities throughout the Mojave, places where survival depended on the ability to identify and eliminate threats before they could establish tactical advantages. Boone's personal tragedy and his skill with a rifle made him both valuable ally and cautionary example, demonstrating how the wasteland's harsh realities could transform ordinary people into instruments of efficient violence while leaving psychological scars that never fully healed. The Khan encampment at Red Rock Canyon provided insight into tribal politics and the complex relationships between traditional social structures and post-war survival requirements. The Great Khan's warrior culture and drug manufacturing expertise represented one approach to maintaining group identity while adapting to economic opportunities that the New World provided. Their alliance negotiations with various factions illustrated how small communities could leverage their unique capabilities to maintain independence while avoiding absorption by larger powers. The strip's bright lights and carefully maintained glamour created an island of pre-war luxury in the middle of post-war desolation, a demonstration of what focused resources and advanced technology could accomplish when applied with sufficient vision and determination. But the contrast between the casino's opulence and the surrounding wasteland's poverty raised questions about sustainability and justice that no amount of neon could illuminate. The security measures and controlled access that maintained the strip's artificial paradise also created barriers that excluded most of the region's population from its benefits. The first meeting with Mr. House in the Lucky 38 revealed the man behind New Vegas's resurrection, a pre-war industrialist who had survived the Great War through technological innovation and emerged as the closest thing to a legitimate authority figure in the post-war Southwest. His proposal for an independent New Vegas, protected by an army of upgraded Securitrons, was both ambitious and practical, offering stability and prosperity without the ideological baggage that characterized both NCR democracy and Legion authoritarianism. House's calculation of odds and strategic planning demonstrated the kind of long-term thinking that most post-war communities lacked, the ability to see beyond immediate survival needs toward the systematic development of sustainable civilization. His vision of New Vegas as a city-state that could eventually challenge the great powers of the East and West was grandiose but not impossible, based on concrete advantages in technology, geography, and economic positioning that could be leveraged into genuine independence if properly managed. The NCR's Camp McCarran and Colonel Moore's briefings provided insight into the Republic's military capabilities and strategic thinking, revealing both strengths and weaknesses that would determine their chances of successfully annexing the Mojave region. The democratic ideals that motivated NCR expansion were admirable, but their implementation often fell short of theoretical perfection, creating opportunities for corruption and inefficiency that more autocratic systems could exploit. The tension between military necessity and civilian oversight created decision-making processes that were often too slow for the rapid responses that wasteland conflicts required. Ambassador Crocker's political maneuvering and diplomatic initiatives demonstrated the NCR's preferred methods for resolving conflicts through negotiation rather than violence, but also revealed the limitations of democratic governance when dealing with opponents who viewed compromise as weakness rather than strength. The Republic's commitment to due process and legal procedures created vulnerabilities that more ruthless enemies could exploit, while their respect for individual rights made the kind of harsh measures that might ensure victory politically unacceptable to voters back home. Caesar's Legion camp at Fortification Hill provided the Courier's first opportunity to observe the Eastern faction's military organization and ideological indoctrination programs up close, revealing the systematic brutality that made their battlefield effectiveness possible. The slavery, crucifixions, and complete subordination of individual identity to collective purpose created a society that was simultaneously powerful and fragile, capable of inspiring absolute loyalty or total rebellion depending on circumstances and implementation. The meeting with Caesar himself revealed an intelligent and educated leader whose adoption of Roman symbolism and authoritarian methods was not nostalgic romanticism, but calculated strategy designed to create stable governance in regions where democratic institutions had failed completely. His critique of NCR corruption and inefficiency was not entirely wrong, even if his proposed solutions involved levels of violence and oppression that most civilized people would find morally unacceptable. The conversation illustrated how legitimate grievances could be used to justify illegitimate methods. The choice between supporting Caesar's Legion, the NCR, Mr. House, or an independent New Vegas was not simply a matter of selecting the faction with the most appealing ideology, but of calculating which approach would produce the best outcomes for the greatest number of people while remaining achievable, given available resources and likely opposition. Each option offered different combinations of benefits and costs, different approaches to the fundamental questions of governance and social organization that faced every post-war community. The Battle of Hoover Dam, that would determine the Mojave's future, was not simply a military engagement, but a test of competing visions for post-war America, a conflict where victory would be determined not just by superior firepower, but by the ability to inspire loyalty and maintain unit cohesion under extreme pressure. The dam itself was both symbol and substance, representing the kind of pre-war infrastructure that could support large populations, while also serving as the practical foundation for whatever government emerged from the fighting. The most likely canonical outcome, suggested by Mr. House's appearance in the Fallout television series, was the Courier's decision to fulfill the original delivery contract and support House's vision of an independent New Vegas. This choice represented not revolutionary idealism or factional loyalty, but professional competence. The completion of a job that had been undertaken for payment rather than political conviction. The decision aligned with the Courier's probable background as someone whose primary concern was successful completion of assigned tasks rather than broader questions of social justice or political theory. House's survival and continued control of New Vegas created the most interesting possibilities for future development, maintaining a balance of power that prevented any single faction from dominating the region while preserving space for alternative approaches to post-war governance. The upgraded Securitron army provided sufficient military capability to deter external conquest, while the Strip's economic advantages offered sustainable funding for continued independence. The arrangement was not perfect, but it was stable and allowed for gradual improvement over time. The Courier's departure from the Mojave after the Second Battle of Hoover Dam was motivated not by boredom or restlessness, but by recognition that their work in the region was complete and that other challenges awaited elsewhere in the wasteland. The Big Mountain Research and Development Center represented a different kind of problem, one that required not military victory or political negotiation, but careful stewardship of scientific knowledge that was too dangerous to abandon, but too valuable to destroy. Big Mountain's think tank and their pre-war experiments in consciousness transfer and technological enhancement offered both tremendous opportunities for human advancement and existential threats to human survival, depending on how their discoveries were managed and applied. The Courier's role as guardian of this knowledge was both privilege and responsibility, requiring the kind of moral judgment that academic institutions often lacked when pursuing research goals without considering practical consequences. The decision to remain at Big Mountain rather than returning to active Courier work represented a fundamental shift in priorities, from short-term problem-solving to long-term stewardship of resources that could reshape humanity's future if properly managed. The research facilities and experimental technologies that the think tank had developed required someone with practical experience in wasteland survival and moral flexibility in unusual situations, qualifications that few post-war individuals possessed. The years that followed the Courier's withdrawal to Big Mountain were characterized not by dramatic adventures, but by the patient work of cataloging discoveries, securing dangerous experiments, and gradually releasing beneficial technologies to communities that could use them responsibly. The role was simultaneously important and anonymous, requiring the Courier to abandon personal recognition in favor of collective benefit, to work behind the scenes rather than in the spotlight that had characterized the Battle of Hoover Dam. The theoretical possibility that the Courier might eventually return to active involvement in wasteland politics remained open, but the responsibilities of guarding Big Mountain's secrets made extended absences increasingly difficult to justify. The knowledge contained in the research facility was too important to leave unguarded and too dangerous to entrust to individuals whose commitment to human welfare had not been tested under extreme conditions. The Courier had become prisoner of their own success, trapped by the very importance of their stewardship role. The legacy that the Courier left to future generations was not measured in territories conquered or governments established, but in the careful preservation of scientific knowledge that might someday enable humanity to transcend the limitations that post-war conditions had imposed. The work was unglamorous and largely unrecognized, but it represented the kind of long-term thinking that sustainable civilization required, the willingness to sacrifice immediate gratification for future benefits that might not be realized for decades or centuries. The mystery that surrounded the Courier's identity and background was never fully resolved, because it was never the most important aspect of their story. What mattered was not who they had been, but what they chose to do when presented with opportunities to shape the wasteland's future. The blank slate created by Benny's bullet had been filled not with recovered memories, but with conscious choices about what kind of person to become and what kind of world to help create. In the end, the Courier's journey from death to resurrection to stewardship represented one possible path for post-war heroism, a model that emphasized responsibility over glory, long-term thinking over immediate satisfaction, and anonymous service over public recognition. The choice to guard Big Mountain's secrets was both ending and beginning, the conclusion of one chapter and the opening of another, in the ongoing story of humanity's struggle to rebuild something better than what had been lost in nuclear fire. The morning of October 23rd, 2077, began for Nate, like so many others in suburban Sanctuary Hills, with coffee brewing in the kitchen while his wife Nora fed their infant son Sean. Domestic tranquility that felt as permanent and predictable as the sunrise that painted their neighborhood in golden autumn light. The house they had built together embodied everything that pre-war America promised to those who served their country faithfully: stability, prosperity, and the chance to raise children in safety, while contributing to a community that valued both individual achievement and collective responsibility. Nate's military service in the 2nd Battalion 108th Infantry Regiment had ended 2 years earlier, but the discipline and strategic thinking that combat experience had instilled remained central to his approach to civilian challenges. The transition from soldier to husband and father had not been seamless, requiring adjustments in priorities and methods that sometimes left him feeling disconnected from the life he was building even as he appreciated its blessings. The nightmares that occasionally disrupted his sleep were manageable reminders of experiences that most of his neighbors could never understand or share. The Vault-Tec representative who appeared at their door that morning seemed like nothing more than an aggressive salesman pushing products that no reasonable person would ever need. But his presence would prove to be the last normal interaction of the pre-war world. The conversation about vault space and family protection was conducted with the casual assumption that civilization would continue indefinitely, that the preparations being discussed were insurance policies against unlikely disasters rather than immediate necessities for survival. The paperwork that Nate completed was filed away as routine bureaucracy, rather than recognized as documentation that would determine his family's fate. The air raid sirens that began wailing less than an hour later transformed the morning's domestic routine into desperate flight toward Vault 111, a underground sanctuary that had seemed like an unnecessary precaution until the moment when nuclear fire appeared on the horizon. The sprint across Sanctuary Hills with Sean in his arms and Nora beside him was the last time Nate would experience the simple terror of conventional danger, fear that could be addressed through speed and determination, rather than the existential dread that would characterize his post-war existence. The vault door's closure marked not just the end of the world above, but the beginning of an imprisonment that would stretch across centuries. Though Nate had no way of knowing that the cryogenic preservation that Vault Tech promised as temporary protection would become a prison of ice and dreams that lasted longer than the civilization he was trying to preserve. The pod that enclosed his family was both salvation and trap, keeping them alive while the world above burned and changed in ways that would make their eventual awakening a resurrection into an alien landscape. The dreams that filled Nate's cryogenic sleep were not peaceful, but haunted, fragments of memory and imagination that blended his military service with domestic happiness in combinations that created narratives of loss and recovery that prepared him psychologically for traumas he had not yet experienced. The subconscious processing that continued during preservation created connections between past experiences and future challenges that would prove crucial when consciousness finally returned to a body that had survived unchanged while everything familiar had been transformed beyond recognition. The awakening that came in 2287 was not gradual return to consciousness, but violent resurrection into nightmare. The discovery that the family he had tried to protect had been shattered by forces that his military training had never prepared him to understand or combat. The sight of Sean being torn from Nora's arms while she was murdered before his eyes was simultaneously real memory and waking nightmare. Trauma that was immediate and decades old. Fresh wound and ancient scar that had been preserved perfectly in cryogenic suspension. The commonwealth that greeted Nate when he finally emerged from Vault 111 was simultaneously familiar and alien. Recognizable landmarks transformed by 2 centuries of abandonment and mutation into something that retained the skeleton of the old world, while being clothed in the harsh realities of post-war survival. Sanctuary Hills had become ruins overgrown with radioactive vegetation. Houses that had sheltered families now home to raiders and raid roaches. Streets where children had played now patrolled by creatures that defied every category of natural history. Codsworth's continued presence in the ruins of their neighborhood was both comfort and torture, a reminder of domestic normalcy that emphasized how completely that world had been destroyed while providing continuity that made emotional processing of the loss possible. The robot's cheerful maintenance of routines that no longer served any purpose illustrated the gulf between pre-war assumptions and post-war realities, the way that loyalty and dedication could become tragic when applied to circumstances that had been fundamentally altered by forces beyond anyone's control. The settlement that Nate began building at Sanctuary Hills was not mere nostalgia, but practical application of pre-war organizational principles to post-war survival challenges, creating a community that honored the past while adapting to present necessities. The houses he constructed from salvaged materials were not attempts to recreate pre-war luxury, but efforts to provide security and comfort that would enable people to think beyond immediate survival toward longer-term goals that required stability and cooperation to achieve. The Minutemen that Preston Garvey represented embodied both the best and worst of pre-war American idealism, a militia movement that combined genuine commitment to protecting innocent people with organizational dysfunction that had led to their near extinction. The decision to rebuild the Minutemen as a functioning military force required Nate to balance democratic ideals with military efficiency, creating structures that could respond quickly to emergencies while maintaining the community support that legitimized their authority. Diamond City's existence as a functioning settlement built within the ruins of Fenway Park demonstrated that post-war communities could achieve something approaching pre-war prosperity if they were willing to adapt creatively to available resources while maintaining social structures that encouraged cooperation rather than exploitation. The mayor's administration and the city's merchants showed that capitalism and democracy could function in post-war conditions, though the presence of synths and the Institute's manipulation revealed vulnerabilities that threatened the entire social fabric. The search for Sean that motivated Nate's journey through the Commonwealth was both personal quest and education in post-war politics, teaching him about the various factions that competed for control of the region, while providing emotional framework that made those political conflicts personally meaningful. The kidnapping was not just family tragedy, but symbol of everything that the post-war world had stolen from pre-war survivors, the way that violence and technology could be used to destroy bonds that seemed fundamental and permanent. The Brotherhood of Steel that arrived in the Commonwealth represented military efficiency and technological superiority, qualities that appealed to someone with Nate's background, while also raising questions about the relationship between effective governance and individual freedom. Elder Maxon's leadership style and the Brotherhood's hierarchical organization offered clear command structures and defined objectives that were easier to navigate than the Commonwealth's political chaos, but their methods often conflicted with the humanitarian ideals that motivated Nate's commitment to protecting innocent people. The Railroad's commitment to helping synths escape from Institute slavery was morally admirable but tactically naive, requiring enormous risks for limited results that did not address the fundamental problems created by the Institute's existence. The organization's secrecy and cell structure made them effective at avoiding detection but inefficient at coordinating large-scale operations, creating opportunities for individual heroism while limiting their strategic impact on the broader conflict between human and artificial intelligence. The institute that Nate discovered beneath the ruins of the Commonwealth Institute of Technology was simultaneously the most advanced technological civilization in post-war America and the most morally bankrupt, a community that had preserved pre-war scientific knowledge while abandoning every ethical principle that might have justified its preservation. The clean corridors and advanced equipment created an environment that felt more like pre-war normality than anything else in the Commonwealth. But the slavery and experimentation that sustained this artificial paradise revealed the costs that such preservation had required. The revelation that Sean had become father, the Institute's director, was both reunion and loss. The discovery that the child Nate had tried to protect had grown into a man whose values and methods were fundamentally incompatible with everything his father believed about human dignity and moral responsibility. The 60-year-old scientist who greeted him was both his son and a stranger, familiar in appearance but alien in thought, carrying Nate's genetic legacy while rejecting every moral principle that had motivated the original kidnapping rescue mission. The choice between destroying the Institute or working within it to reform its practices was complicated by the relationship between father and son, the way that family bonds could complicate political decisions, while also providing emotional stakes that made abstract moral questions personally urgent. The synths who had been created as slaves deserved freedom and protection, but the scientific knowledge that the Institute had preserved could benefit all humanity if properly applied to post-war challenges, rather than being hoarded for the benefit of an underground elite. The decision to destroy the Institute with the help of the Minutemen represented both military victory and personal tragedy, the elimination of a threat to Commonwealth freedom achieved through the loss of scientific resources that could have advanced human recovery from post-war conditions. The nuclear explosion that consumed the underground facility was both liberation and waste, freeing enslaved synths while destroying knowledge that had taken centuries to accumulate and might have taken centuries more to redevelop. The Brotherhood ending that seemed more likely given Nate's military background would have required him to overcome personal relationships in favor of organizational loyalty, supporting Maxon's vision of technological control, even when it conflicted with his own moral instincts about protecting innocent people. The assault on the Institute using Liberty Prime would have been both tactically satisfying and emotionally devastating, achieving military objectives while requiring the sacrifice of family relationships that had motivated the entire quest. Liberty Prime's resurrection and deployment to the Commonwealth demonstrated the Brotherhood's technological capabilities, while also revealing their approach to problem-solving, the preference for overwhelming force rather than diplomatic negotiation that characterized military organizations throughout human history. The robots' patriotic slogans and nuclear capabilities embodied both the promise and the threat of pre-war American power, technology that could protect freedom or destroy it depending on who controlled the activation codes. The aftermath of the Institute's destruction left the Commonwealth with a power vacuum that could be filled by various factions with different approaches to governance and social organization, creating opportunities for the kind of institution building that Nate's military and civilian experience had prepared him to undertake. The Minutemen's democratic ideals and the Brotherhood's military efficiency could potentially be combined into a system that provided both security and freedom, if the integration could be managed without triggering conflicts between competing organizational cultures. The settlement system that Nate developed throughout the Commonwealth was both practical necessity and political experiment, demonstrating how pre-war organizational principles could be adapted to post-war conditions, while providing concrete benefits to people who had been abandoned by larger institutions. The trade networks, defense agreements, and resource sharing that connected various communities created the foundation for regional government that could eventually challenge the more centralized approaches favored by other factions. The personal cost of Nate's heroism was measured not just in physical danger and material sacrifice, but in the psychological burden of making decisions that affected entire communities while dealing with the trauma of family loss and the disorientation of awakening in an alien world. The leadership role that circumstances had forced upon him required constant adaptation and learning, the development of skills and knowledge that no pre-war experience had provided, while maintaining moral principles that post-war pragmatism constantly challenged. The question of whether Nate had become a paladin in the Brotherhood or remained general of the Minutemen was less important than the recognition that both organizations had been changed by his involvement, influenced by someone whose pre-war experience and post-war adaptability provided perspectives that neither group could have developed independently. The institutional changes that resulted from his leadership would continue long after his personal involvement ended, creating legacies that extended beyond individual achievement towards systemic transformation. The theory that Nate had achieved dual membership in both organizations was attractive because it reflected the kind of pragmatic coalition building that successful post-war leadership required. The ability to work with different groups while maintaining personal integrity and strategic vision. The Brotherhood's resources and the Minutemen's legitimacy could complement each other if properly coordinated, creating security arrangements that protected both technological assets and democratic values. The commonwealth that emerged from these conflicts was not the pre-war world restored, but something new that combined the best aspects of multiple approaches to post-war governance. A society that had learned from both the failures that had led to nuclear war and the successes that had enabled survival in its aftermath. The clean water, secure communities, and functioning institutions that Nate helped establish were not perfect, but they were sustainable, and they offered hope for continued improvement through democratic processes rather than authoritarian control. In the end, Nate's transformation from pre-war soldier to post-war leader represented one possible path for bridging the gap between old world knowledge and new world needs, demonstrating how individual commitment to moral principles could produce institutional changes that benefited entire regions. His story was not completed by any single victory, but continued in the daily choices made by communities that had learned from his example that cooperation was possible even when trust was difficult, that leadership meant service rather than domination, and that the future remained open to influence by people willing to work for something better than what they had inherited. The legacy that Nate left to the Commonwealth was measured not in monuments or official recognition, but in the functioning institutions and cooperative relationships that made normal life possible for people who had been surviving rather than living, who had been afraid rather than hopeful, who had been isolated rather than connected to communities that shared their values and supported their aspirations for themselves and their children. The threads that bound the 6 protagonists across 2 centuries of post-war history were woven not from coincidence, but from the inexorable logic of cause and effect, each hero's choices creating ripples that spread across the wasteland to shape the challenges and opportunities that awaited their successors. The water chip that sent the Vault Dweller into the wasteland was manufactured in the same facilities that would later produce the technology that powered Mr. House's Securitron army, connecting the earliest post-war crisis to the battle for New Vegas through chains of industrial inheritance that spanned generations of technological development and decline. The village of Arroyo that grew from the Vault Dwellers' leadership provided the foundation for everything that followed in the wasteland's political evolution, demonstrating that communities built on cooperation rather than exploitation could not only survive but prosper in conditions that had destroyed the old world's more complex institutions. The refugees who joined Albert Cole in his northern migration carried with them not just personal hopes for better lives, but collective memories of pre-war civilization that would be preserved and transmitted through generations of oral tradition and practical demonstration. The new California Republic that the Chosen One encountered during his quest for the Garden of Eden creation kit was the direct descendant of the Vault Dwellers community, expanded and formalized into governmental structures that reflected both the democratic ideals of pre-war America and the practical necessities of post-war survival. The constitution that governed NCR operations was not copied from pre-war documents, but crafted from lived experience of what worked and what failed when people tried to build sustainable institutions from the wreckage of nuclear war. The hub's transformation from trading post to economic center illustrated how individual choices about cooperation and competition could accumulate over decades into regional systems that determined the possibilities available to later generations of wasteland inhabitants. The merchant families that dominated hub politics during the Vault Dwellers era established trading networks and economic relationships that would eventually support the NCR's expansion eastward toward the Colorado River and beyond, creating the infrastructure of commerce that made large-scale political integration possible. The Brotherhood of Steel's evolution from technological monastery to military powerhouse reflected the organization's repeated encounters with wasteland heroes who forced them to confront the limitations of isolation and the necessities of engagement with broader communities. The Vault Dwellers' alliance with the original Brotherhood during the war against the Master established precedents for cooperation with outsiders that would be alternately embraced and rejected by later generations of Brotherhood leadership as they struggled to balance doctrinal purity with practical effectiveness. Elder Lyon's humanitarian mission in the capital wasteland represented one possible interpretation of the Brotherhood's core values, an attempt to apply their technological advantages to the systematic improvement of wasteland living conditions, rather than the mere preservation of pre-war knowledge for its own sake. The Lone Wanderer's support for this mission, and his role in projects like water purification, demonstrated how individual heroes could influence institutional development by providing examples of what was possible when advanced technology was combined with moral commitment to community welfare. The reaction against Leon's policies that brought Arthur Maxson to power illustrated how organizations could be transformed not just by external pressures, but by internal debates about identity and purpose that were shaped by generational changes in leadership and membership. The young soldiers who served under Maxson had different experiences and expectations than the veterans who had followed Leon, creating opportunities for ideological shifts that would not have been possible if the Brotherhood's membership had remained static over time. The Institute's development from pre-war research facility to post-war technocracy was both parallel to and opposite from the Brotherhood's evolution, demonstrating how similar starting conditions could produce radically different outcomes, depending on the values and assumptions that guided institutional decision-making. Where the Brotherhood had chosen to engage with the wastelands communities while maintaining technological superiority, the Institute had chosen complete isolation, combined with systematic exploitation of surface populations through kidnapping and replacement programs. The synths that the Institute created as slaves and the railroad that emerged to help them escape represented a new category of moral challenge that previous generations of wasteland heroes had not faced. Questions about consciousness and identity that became urgent only when artificial intelligence achieved levels of sophistication that made the distinction between human and synthetic increasingly difficult to maintain. The sole survivor's encounters with these questions forced decisions about personhood and freedom that had implications extending far beyond the immediate conflict between factions. The recurring theme of family relationships across all 6 protagonist stories reflected both the universal human need for connection and belonging, and the particular challenges that post-war conditions created for maintaining such relationships across generations and geographical distances. The Vault Dwellers' marriage to Pat and their daughter's lives in Arroyo, the Chosen One's unknown son in New Reno, the Lone Wanderer's relationship with James and Project Purity, the Courier's blank slate and chosen family in Big Mountain, the sole survivor's loss of Nora and search for Sean, each represented different approaches to the fundamental question of how love and loyalty could survive in a world designed to destroy both. The technological inheritance that passed from generation to generation of wasteland heroes was both blessing and burden, providing tools that could solve immediate problems, while creating new dilemmas that required wisdom and moral judgment to resolve effectively. The weapons that the Vault Dweller used to defeat the Master's army were ancestors of the energy weapons that the Brotherhood of Steel hoarded centuries later, while the medical knowledge that saved lives in Arroyo became the foundation for the Institute's biotechnology programs that would eventually create synthetic humans indistinguishable from their organic counterparts. The GEC technology that saved Arroyo and helped establish the NCR was related to the terraforming systems that the Vault 76 dwellers used to restore Appalachia's ecosystem, demonstrating how pre-war science could be applied to post-war challenges when it was properly understood and ethically implemented. The difference between successful and disastrous applications of advanced technology often depended not on technical specifications but on the moral framework that guided their deployment and the social structures that regulated their deployment. Use. The mutation and adaptation that characterized post-war biology created both opportunities and challenges that none of the protagonists could have anticipated based on pre-war knowledge or early post-war experience. The death claws that the Chosen One encountered at Vault 13 were related to the creatures that the Lone Wanderer fought in the capital wasteland, but 2 centuries of evolution and environmental pressure had produced variations that required different tactical approaches and raised different questions about the relationship between intelligence and humanity. The ghouls who appeared in every protagonist's story represented the most successful form of human adaptation to post-war radiation levels. Survivors whose physical transformation had granted them virtual immortality at the cost of social acceptance and psychological stability. The relationships that developed between smooth-skinned humans and their ghoul neighbors illustrated both the potential for cooperation across biological boundaries and the persistent prejudices that could undermine such cooperation when fear and ignorance were allowed to dominate rational assessment of actual threats and benefits. The supermutants that appeared in different forms throughout post-war history demonstrated how the same basic biological manipulation could produce vastly different results, depending on the methods used and the purposes that motivated their creation. The Master's army of Unity Seekers, the capital wasteland's aggressive but simple-minded giants, and the Commonwealth's various strains of artificially enhanced humans each reflected different approaches to the fundamental question of whether human improvement required the abandonment of human consciousness and individual identity. The economic systems that developed across different regions of post-war America showed how trade and commerce could emerge from the wreckage of nuclear war when people were willing to trust each other enough to engage in mutually beneficial exchanges rather than zero-sum competition for scarce resources. The bottle caps that served as currency in most wasteland communities were backed not by government guarantees, but by collective agreement about value and utility, demonstrating how social institutions could emerge organically from practical necessity rather than being imposed by political authority. The religious and philosophical movements that emerged from post-war conditions reflected humanity's persistent need for meaning and transcendence, even in circumstances that seemed to prove the universe's indifference to human suffering and aspiration. The Hubologists, the children of Atom, the various tribal belief systems, and the secular humanism that characterized most hero protagonists each offered different answers to questions about purpose and destiny that became urgent when traditional institutions and assumptions had been destroyed by nuclear fire. The educational systems that different communities developed to transmit knowledge and values to younger generations illustrated the challenges of preserving civilization when formal institutions had been destroyed and informal networks had to carry the entire burden of cultural continuity. The vault-based education that produced the Vault Dweller and the Lone Wanderer, the tribal traditions that shaped the Chosen One, the military training that influenced the sole survivor, and the practical apprenticeships that characterized most wasteland communities, each represented different approaches to the fundamental question of what knowledge was most important for survival and flourishing. The leadership styles that the 6 protagonists developed reflected both their individual personalities and the specific challenges they faced, but common patterns emerged that suggested universal principles for effective post-war governance and community organization. The emphasis on leading by example rather than command, the willingness to make personal sacrifices for community benefit, the ability to adapt strategies to changing circumstances while maintaining consistent values, and the recognition that true leadership meant preparing others to function independently rather than creating permanent dependencies. The military conflicts that shaped each protagonist's story were not simply battles between good and evil, but complex political situations where competing visions of post-war society collided in ways that required both tactical skill and moral judgment to navigate successfully. The war against the Master's unity, the campaign against the Enclave's genetic purification, the struggle for control of the capital wasteland's resources, the battle for New Vegas's independence, and the conflict over the Institute's synthetic human programs each represented different aspects of the broader challenge of determining what kind of civilization should emerge from the ashes of nuclear war. The diplomatic relationships that the protagonists established with various factions and communities demonstrated the importance of negotiation and compromise in achieving sustainable solutions to regional conflicts, showing how military victory was often less important than the political arrangements that followed successful campaigns. The alliances that the Vault Dweller built with the Brotherhood of Steel, the Chosen One's integration of Arroyo and Vault, 13 refugees, the Lone Wanderer's work with Elder Lions, the Courier's balancing of competing interests in the Mojave, and the Sole Survivors coalition building in the Commonwealth. Each illustrated different approaches to the challenge of building consensus among groups with different interests and priorities. The environmental challenges that faced each protagonist reflected both the immediate consequences of nuclear war and the longer-term effects of ecological disruption on human communities and natural systems. The radiation that threatened the Vault Dweller, the drought that motivated the Chosen One, the poisoned water that drove the Lone Wanderer's quest, the territorial disputes that complicated the Courier's mission, and the Institute's underground isolation from surface conditions, each represented different aspects of the fundamental challenge of creating sustainable relationships between human civilization and the natural environment that supported it. The technological mysteries that each protagonist encountered, from the water chip and Gek to the platinum chip and synth components, were not just plot devices, but symbols of the broader challenge of understanding and controlling the technological inheritance that pre-war civilization had left scattered across the wasteland. The decision of whether to preserve, modify, or destroy advanced technology often determined the trajectory of entire regions for generations, making technological literacy a crucial skill for post-war leadership, while also creating temptations for those who might use advanced capabilities for selfish or destructive purposes. The moral evolution that characterized each protagonist's journey from innocent vault dweller or tribal villager to experienced wasteland leader reflected the broader challenge of maintaining ethical principles while adapting to conditions that had not been anticipated by traditional moral frameworks. The pragmatic compromises that survival required, the utilitarian calculations that resource scarcity demanded, and the tragic choices that leadership imposed, all tested the protagonist's abilities to remain recognizably human, while developing the hardness and flexibility that effective action in post-war conditions required. The legacy systems that each protagonist established or contributed to, from Arroyo's democratic traditions to the Brotherhood's technological preservation mission to the Commonwealth settlement networks, represented attempts to create institutional frameworks that could outlast individual leaders while preserving the values and insights that those leaders had developed through their experiences. The challenge was always to balance stability with adaptability, ensuring that institutions could maintain their core functions while evolving to meet changing circumstances and opportunities. In the end, The threads that connected these 6 stories were not just historical causation but moral continuity. The persistent human commitment to building something better than what existed, to protecting the innocent and vulnerable, to preserving knowledge and wisdom while applying them to practical challenges, and to maintaining hope for the future despite overwhelming evidence that the universe was indifferent to human aspirations and that individual efforts might ultimately prove futile in the face of forces too large for any single person to influence or control. The simulation theory that emerged from careful analysis of Vault 76's unique circumstances represented both the most elegant explanation for Appalachia's anomalous conditions and the most disturbing possibility about the nature of post-war reality itself. The evidence supporting this interpretation was circumstantial but compelling, beginning with the vault's pristine environment that seemed inconsistent with known patterns of nuclear devastation, and extending through a series of technological and narrative inconsistencies that suggested systematic manipulation rather than organic development of post-war conditions. The terminal entries discovered in the White Spring bunker provided the first concrete indication that someone within the simulation was questioning the fundamental nature of their reality, documenting observations that the world around them felt artificial and predetermined rather than chaotic and unpredictable, as post-war conditions should logically be. The writer's conviction that they were trapped in a virtual strategic simulation game was dismissed by other vault dwellers as psychological breakdown caused by isolation stress, but the specific details of their complaints corresponded too closely to known characteristics of pre-war training programs to be entirely coincidental. The graffiti that appeared throughout Appalachia, declaring that nothing is real, could be interpreted as the desperate communications of individuals who had somehow broken through the simulation's programming to recognize their true circumstances, though it could equally well represent the psychological deterioration of people overwhelmed by the cognitive dissonance between their expectations of post-war devastation and the reality of their relatively comfortable existence. The persistence and distribution of these messages suggested either systematic delusion or systematic revelation, depending on the observer's assumptions about the nature of reality. The technology that would have been required to create a simulation encompassing all of Appalachia was theoretically possible based on pre-war advances in virtual reality and consciousness manipulation, as demonstrated by the memory den in Goodneighbor and the virtual reality pods in Vault 112. But the processing power and energy requirements for maintaining such an extensive simulation while keeping hundreds of participants unconscious for extended periods would have exceeded anything that Vault Tech had demonstrated in other facilities, requiring technological capabilities that approached the theoretical limits of pre-war science. The most significant obstacle to accepting the simulation theory was the presence of information within the Appalachian environment that Vault Tech should not have possessed when they designed their experiment, including detailed knowledge of the Brotherhood of Steel's organizational structure, accurate representations of super-mutant biology, and realistic depictions of ghoul psychology that could only have been obtained through direct observation of post-war conditions. The theory required either that Vault Tech had access to intelligence sources that extended far beyond their known capabilities, or that someone was actively updating the simulation based on real-world developments. The possibility that the simulation was being maintained and modified by an external agency with access to genuine post-war information was both more plausible and more unsettling than the alternative explanation that everything the Vault dwellers experienced was entirely artificial. This interpretation suggested that real people in the actual wasteland were being observed and studied to provide content for the virtual environment, raising questions about consent and exploitation that went beyond simple imprisonment to encompass systematic violation of privacy and autonomy for entire populations. The sudden disappearance of Appalachia from all subsequent historical records could support either interpretation of events, whether the region had been destroyed by nuclear fire when the simulation ended, or had never existed as a physical location in the first place. The complete absence of references to the area in later Fallout games and the lack of migration from Appalachia to other regions suggested either systematic cover-up of a successful community or the simple fact that there had never been anything there to cover up. The theory that Nobark Nan was actually the chosen one living under an assumed identity represented a more conventional mystery about personal transformation and hidden history, based on circumstantial evidence that was suggestive but far from conclusive. The wrecked highwayman outside Novak was certainly the same model of vehicle that the Chosen One could acquire and modify during his journey, but the presence of a single abandoned car in the Mojave Desert was hardly unique evidence given the number of pre-war vehicles scattered throughout the wasteland. The armored Vault 13 jumpsuit that appeared in the car's trunk when the J. Sawyer mod was installed provided more specific evidence linking the vehicle to the Chosen One's story, but the modification's status as cut content rather than canonical material raised questions about its validity as evidence. The developers' decision to include this detail in unofficial content suggested that they had considered the connection between Nobark and the Chosen One, but had ultimately decided not to make it explicit in the finished game. The behavioral similarities between Nobark and the Chosen One were limited but intriguing, particularly the encounters with talking animals that characterized both figures' experiences and suggested either shared psychological conditions or genuine supernatural encounters that were consistent across different time periods and locations. The presence of Enclave propaganda in Nobark's shack could indicate either continued interest in the faction that the Chosen One had defeated, or simple scavenging of interesting materials that had no personal significance. The geographic logic of the Chosen One's presence in the Mojave Desert was questionable, given his established role as Elder of Arroyo and his presumed responsibilities to the community that had grown from his successful completion of the JEC mission. The journey from Northern California to the Mojave would have required significant motivation and considerable time away from leadership duties that were already demanding his full attention, making casual tourism an unlikely explanation for his presence in the region during the events of New Vegas. The alternative theory that Bruce Isaac had stolen the highwayman from the Bishop family and crashed it while fleeing New Reno was both more prosaic and more plausible, requiring fewer assumptions about character motivation, while accounting for the vehicle's presence and condition. The connection between the Chosen One and the Bishop family, through his strategic seduction during his original quest, created opportunities for indirect relationships that could explain the car's history without requiring the Chosen One's direct involvement in its abandonment. The mystery of the Lone Wanderer's transformation into Deacon required considerably more speculation about character psychology and institutional politics, but the basic elements of the theory were consistent with known facts about both figures' backgrounds and capabilities. The timeline was appropriate, the geographical connections were plausible, and the skill sets were compatible, but the emotional motivation for such a dramatic personal transformation required assumptions about the Lone Wanderer's relationship with Sarah Lyons and the Brotherhood's internal conflicts that went beyond documented evidence. The University Point death clause that Deacon claimed to have been part of could indeed be interpreted as an allegorical version of actual events involving the Brotherhood of Steel's response to synth infiltration, with the systematic persecution of artificial humans replacing the anti-ghoul violence that the story explicitly described. This interpretation required that Deacon's account be understood as deliberate misdirection designed to convey emotional truth, while concealing specific details that might compromise operational security or personal safety. The facial reconstruction surgery that Deacon had undergone was documented fact rather than speculation, and the technology required for such procedures was available in the capital wasteland through Dr. Reed, Pinkerton's clinic in Rivet City. The psychological motivation for abandoning his original identity was consistent with the kind of trauma that systematic betrayal by trusted institutions could produce, particularly when combined with personal loss that made continued existence under his original name emotionally unbearable. The political dynamics within the Brotherhood of Steel that the theory required were extrapolated from observed tensions between Elder Lyon's humanitarian mission and the traditional doctrine favored by the outcasts, and eventually adopted by Arthur Maxson. The succession crisis that followed Leon's death and the consolidation of power under Maxson's leadership created opportunities for purges and policy reversals that could have targeted individuals whose loyalty to the previous administration made them obstacles to organizational transformation. The suggestion that Sarah Lyons had been replaced by a synth and subsequently executed when this replacement was discovered required several assumptions about Institute capabilities and Brotherhood intelligence that were possible but unverified. The Institute's ability to create synthetic humans, who were indistinguishable from their organic counterparts, was established, but their interest in infiltrating East Coast military organizations was less clear given their primary focus on Commonwealth politics and scientific research. The canonical implications of Mr. House's survival in the television series suggested that the Courier had indeed chosen to complete the original delivery mission rather than pursuing independent or factional alternatives, though the specific details of how this choice was implemented remained unclear. The presence of the Lucky 38 casino and its owner in the show's first season was too significant to be casual reference, suggesting that House's continued control of New Vegas was important to future narrative developments. The strategic logic of supporting Mr. House was consistent with the Courier's probable background as someone whose primary concern was professional competence rather than political ideology, making completion of the contracted delivery a natural choice, regardless of personal feelings about the client or the broader implications of the job. This interpretation treated the Courier as a professional who honored commitments rather than a revolutionary seeking to reshape society according to personal vision. The alternative possibility that the Legion had somehow achieved victory at Hoover Dam seemed inconsistent with the show's apparent emphasis on technological advancement and corporate power, themes that were more compatible with House's vision of progress through private enterprise than with Caesar's rejection of advanced technology in favor of classical social organization. The Legion's anti-technology ideology would have made them poor candidates for the kind of dramatic technological developments that the show seemed to be building toward. The question of Liberty Prime's location and operational status had implications extending beyond simple military hardware to encompass broader questions about the relationship between East and West Coast political developments. The robot's presence on the West Coast suggested either Brotherhood expansion or technology transfer that would require explanation in future episodes, while its continued existence implied that the sole survivor had chosen to preserve rather than destroy the Brotherhood's most powerful weapon. The Brotherhood's presence in California during the events of the television series was documented fact, but the specific reasons for their return to their ancestral homeland and the resources they had brought with them remained unclear. The possibility that Liberty Prime had been disassembled and transported across the continent was technically feasible but logistically challenging, requiring significant commitment of resources and personnel that suggested high-priority objectives rather than routine expansion. The railroad's fate following the Institute's destruction was less clear, but probably involved organizational dissolution rather than violent suppression, since the elimination of synth production would have made their primary mission obsolete, regardless of which faction accomplished the Institute's defeat. The dedicated members who had risked their lives to help synthetic humans escape slavery would have needed to find new purposes and new identities in a world where their specialized skills were no longer required. The Minutemen's continued existence and effectiveness depended heavily on the leadership and organizational skills that the sole survivor had provided during their reconstruction. But the movement's democratic ideals and decentralized structure should have enabled it to survive the transition to new leadership if proper institutions had been established. The settlement network that the Minutemen protected represented a significant population base that would continue to need security services regardless of political changes at higher levels. The canonical weight of these various theories and speculations was ultimately less important than their function as interpretive frameworks that helped make sense of narrative gaps and character motivations that the games had left deliberately ambiguous. The developers' decision to avoid definitive statements about protagonist fates was both practical consideration and artistic choice, allowing players to imagine their own conclusions while preserving narrative flexibility for future installments. The persistence of these mysteries and the creativity they inspired in fans demonstrated the enduring appeal of stories that trusted audiences to participate actively in meaning-making rather than consuming passive entertainment. The gaps in official canon were not flaws to be corrected, but invitations to engagement, opportunities for players to become collaborators in the ongoing creation of post-war mythology. The relationship between official canon and fan interpretation was complicated by the multimedia nature of the Fallout franchise, with games, television, and other media potentially offering conflicting information about character fates and historical events. The challenge for future creators would be balancing respect for player agency and imagination with the narrative requirements of new stories that needed to establish their own canonical foundation. In the end, the theories that emerged from careful analysis of evidence and creative interpretation of ambiguous details served important functions regardless of their literal accuracy, providing frameworks for understanding character psychology, institutional dynamics, and historical causation that enriched the experience of engaging with post-war narratives. The truth of these speculations was less important than their utility as tools for thinking about the deeper themes and questions that the protagonist's stories raised about heroism, sacrifice, and the possibility of meaningful action in circumstances that seemed designed to render individual effort futile. The legends that grew from these interpretations would continue to evolve as new information became available and new perspectives were brought to bear on familiar stories, demonstrating that the Wastelands mythology was not fixed historical record, but living tradition that adapted to changing needs and interests, while preserving essential insights about human nature and social organization that remained relevant regardless of specific technological or political circumstances. And so we reach the end of our journey through the lives of 6 souls who shaped the Wasteland's destiny, each carrying burdens that would have crushed lesser spirits, while finding within themselves the strength to transform impossible circumstances into opportunities for heroism and hope. From the Vault's 76 dwellers, who took America's first tentative steps toward reclamation, to the sole survivor, who bridged the gap between old-world memories and new-world realities, these protagonists demonstrated that individual courage could indeed change the course of history when guided by principles that transcended personal survival. Their stories remind us that heroism is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. Not the possession of perfect knowledge, but the willingness to make difficult choices with incomplete information. Not the guarantee of success, but the commitment to try regardless of odds or obstacles. Each faced moments when surrender would have been understandable and retreat would have been rational, yet each chose to continue forward because something greater than themselves called them to service. Sleep now, fellow wanderer, and let their example comfort you through whatever challenges await in your own tomorrow. In dreams, we join their eternal vigil over the values that make existence meaningful: protection of the innocent, preservation of knowledge, and the patient work of building something better from the fragments of what came before. Rest peacefully, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, guardians keep watch so that hope may survive another day.